Hey everyone, welcome to Stat Chasing Week 5. If this is your first time listening to the show, I am going to be going through the stats that I find most important to kind of kick off my research for the week. So this helps provide me with the foundation for everything that I'm going to be absorbing throughout the rest of the week. And it helps me just kind of figure out what happened over Week 5. The stats that I'm going to be looking at are yards per route run and targets per route run, which come from Pro Football Focus. Targets per route run I find especially useful for tight ends. And I also look at dropbacks so I can see how many routes a wide receiver or tight end is running per dropback. That also comes from PFF. At RotoViz, I get data for air yards and target share. They also have Josh Hermsmeyer's metric Whopper there. I find that especially useful for wide receivers. That combines target share and market share into one metric, market share of air yards into one metric. Average depth of target, ADOT, it also comes from RotoViz. That helps us figure out where wide receivers are being used on the field. You know, if a guy's got an ADOT of 15, he's a deep threat. If it's down at like 7 or 8, might be in more of like that Michael Thomas type of slot role. Expected points also comes from RotoViz. This I find especially useful for running backs. Expected points weights opportunities by the line of scrimmage, and so it can really help establish workloads. So where running backs, we really care about, you know, where they're getting the ball, how much they're getting the ball, and it's almost more about the situations than the running backs themselves. That's where I think expected points is really valuable. I've also been looking at snap data. Last week, I was able to pull the snap data in from RotoViz, which updates after the week is complete, like a day after. I got last week's episode out a little bit late, so I was able to use RotoViz's data. This week, Ben Gretsch alerted me that I can go to Pro Football Reference and get the snap data there. And since I'm really just looking at running back snaps for the most part, I think I'm going to go ahead and keep doing that. So thanks to Ben for pointing that out. And I do have snap data again this week from Pro Football Reference. I will be using some of Ben's terms in his stealing signals, which is excellent. You guys should check that out. He talks about green zone being carries inside the portion of the field from the 10 in is the green zone, and then carries within that range, high value carries or touches, high value touches. So again, going kind of to that expected points idea of waiting by the line of scrimmage. We're really, especially for running backs, wanting to know who's getting those extremely high value that portion of the workload that's going to be near the goal line, because that's obviously going to lead to touchdowns at a much higher rate. A couple shout outs. Change College has been timestamping these videos. This has been awesome. Thank you to Change College for doing that. At Change College on Twitter. Sam Hoppin at Sam Hoppin on Twitter has been creating these charts, which I'm about to get to in a second. We had them last week. They were awesome. We have them again this week. I'm really excited about these. What I'll do here is we dive into the first team. I'll talk through the chart that Sam created for the Cardinals as I go through the teams alphabetically here. After that, I'll probably I won't really talk about the charts all that much. They'll be here on the YouTube if you want to look at them. But yeah, if you're on the podcast, this will translate to audio just as well. So yeah, we can go ahead and dive right into it. Let me pull the chart up here. Let's see. Okay, here we go. So going into Arizona, as I talk through the chart briefly here, we have targets per route run on the x-axis. We have routes per team dropback on the y-axis. So you want to be up here in the top right where you see DeAndre Hopkins basically has been all year. This week, he was getting targeted a little bit less, so he's over a little bit more to the left. The size of each player's bubble is the air yard share that they got this week. So you get a sense of how much were they out there on the field. Guys near the top of the chart were out there on the field running a lot of routes. Guys that were getting targeted at a high rate, like you see Chase Edmonds was getting targeted on nearly 40% of his routes. He's going to be way over here on the right. That's a good thing. But ideally, we want to see guys getting targeted at a really high rate, and we want to see him on the field a lot, and we want to see him with a big air yard bubble like we saw with Christian Kirk this week. He had 32.7% of the air yards next to each player's name, in parentheses, is their air yard share. So that's the chart. That'll be the same for every team as we move through. All right, so for Arizona at running back, Kenyon Drake played 67% of the snaps. He had all 3 of the green zone attempts. He also had a healthy workload of 16 expected points. He did underperform that workload by 2.8 points, though, and he had just 3% of the targets in this game. I think the thing with Drake is that he's going to be highly, highly game script dependent this week. Or not this week, overall, every single week, he's going to be game script dependent because he's not seeing targets. He's just really going to be he's the type of dude who you could see him putting up like 3 touchdowns in a game if everything broke right, because he does seem to have an edge in the green zone work. But he's going to really be dependent on the Cardinals beating teams and kind of blowing them out. He's also 11.4 points below expectations on the season, so he's not played well. He is at risk, I think, of losing work to Chase Edmonds. So it's not like he's necessarily been locked into this game script dependent role. So I definitely get if you have Drake and you're starting to panic a little bit. I think like for DFS purposes, as long as Drake's workload continues to look ahead of Edmonds, then when Arizona sets up for big games and games where they should be ahead by a lot, then he actually does become interesting. Chase Edmonds had 45% of the snaps, which means that Drake and Edmonds were out there together at some points. He had 8.9 expected points. That's not great. I mean, he's still basically a satellite back in this offense, but he did have a 17% target share. He's now at a 14% target share on the season to Drake's 4%. And Edmonds is playing great. He scored 11.3 points over expected this week. That's awesome. It's also not something we can count on. What we need now, if we're on Edmonds here, we need Edmonds to now get more playing time as a result of outplaying Drake, being a more versatile player, being a guy they can trust in the receiving game in the way they don't seem to trust Drake. That's what we need to see going forward. The efficiency that Edmonds delivered is not going to last. So hopefully, for Edmonds owners, something comes out of this in terms of the playing time. If not, then I think Edmonds is going to be pretty tough to trust week to week, but he should have some spike weeks. At wide receiver, DeAndre Hopkins came back to earth a little bit here. As I pointed out on the chart, he was not targeted at quite as high of a rate as he typically has. He was at a season low, 20% target share. He did run a route on 89% of dropbacks. He did actually have a really big game in this game, like in the box score, but he had an 18.7 yards per target. So it's kind of interesting because his success to date has been driven by this gigantic workload. He hasn't been all that efficient on his targets. This week, he was super efficient on his targets. And I think that's actually kind of nice to see. We don't want a guy who's just solely driven by the team feeding him. We want him to reward that team for feeding him some weeks so that he can, make sure that he's defending that workload. So I think that this was actually kind of an exciting week for Hopkins overall because we're not that concerned about Hopkins losing his workload. We know he has the ability to earn targets at an extremely high rate. This is a very, very talented player. So I actually think this week was kind of a nice development. And he had a 31% target. He has a 31% target share on the season. So all in all, he still has this gigantic workload. So kind of nice to see him pop off with that yards per target efficiency. Christian Kirk benefited from Hopkins getting targeted at a lower rate this week. He had a season high 20% target share. He had a route run on 79% of his dropbacks. He's got an ADOT of 13.7, and that's this week. And then he ended up with 33% of the air yards this week, and actually the highest Whopper this week as well because of that deeper downfield role. At times, he's been used extremely deep downfield. This week, he was just at 13.7, which was a bit nicer to see. I think when he's in that 13, 14, even 15 range on a week, that's when he's going to have an easier time. At points, he's been up in like the mid-20s. Andy Isabella ran a route on 50% of dropbacks. He continues to just be kind of a halftime player. I mentioned last week that his routes per dropback actually increased last week compared to the week before, Kirk missed the week before, and then he came back, and Isabella's routes did increase, but Isabella wasn't able to earn targets last week when Kirk was out on the field at as high of a rate as he did in week 3. And that's kind of, again, the case on the season, again, the case this week. On the season, Isabella has been targeted on 18% of his routes, which is a good amount for a deep threat. So overall, the bigger concern with Isabella is just that he's not on the field enough. We see here Larry Fitzgerald is running a lot of routes. I think Larry Fitzgerald needs to get less playing time for both Kirk and Isabella to really be strong options. Isabella is you can't trust him right now because of just him being out there only half the time. Dan Arnold ran a route on 29% of dropbacks in this game. He wasn't targeted. Darrell Daniels ran the most routes, actually, 42% of dropbacks. He only had 2 targets. Situation looks like a total mess at tight end here. Moving to Atlanta. Todd Gurley played on 55% of snaps. He had 14.5 expected points. He was the only running back to get a green zone touch. He turned that into 150 total yards and a touchdown. Really nice game for Todd Gurley. However, he had 10.4 points over expected in this game. That's how he had such a nice box score game. So we know that this Panthers defense is really bad. It was nice to see Gurley take advantage of it. I was skeptical that he could even do that, but I don't know that, we're going to be able to count on him to deliver this huge efficiency in the rushing game. However, I will say it was a nice development that Gurley got 5 targets and a 14% target share in this game. He ran a route on 51% of dropbacks. That is nice, and I think something that's more sustainable, at least potentially so. Ito Smith wasn't targeted in this game, and Brian Hill had a 6% target share. He ran a route on 31% of dropbacks. Ito Smith had the highest target share last week. So this could just be noise for whatever reason he wasn't involved this week and he'll be back. But, if Gurley can consolidate receiving work and kind of take Ito Smith's receiving work and bring it into his own workload, that's a pretty important boost to his value. So something to keep an eye on here, Todd Gurley's receiving role. At wide receiver, Calvin Ridley looked to be healthy again this week. He ran a route on 85% of dropbacks, which is likely a bit lower than it would have been if he was fully healthy, but, healthy enough. Targeted on 30% of his routes, had a 29% target share, 46% air yard share. See him on the chart here, really popping. Olamide Zacchaeus ran a route on 100% of dropbacks, but he turned that into just 4 targets. He went 1 for 13 on the day. Targeted at a pretty low rate on his routes, just 8%. Target per route run. Russell Gage only ran a route on 67% of dropbacks, but he had 14% of targets and air yards. Basically seems to have kept the same role even with Julio Jones out. Zacchaeus is sort of filling in for one of the outside guys more, but obviously with Ridley back and just being a much stronger receiver than Zacchaeus, his target rate fell way off. I think he probably benefited from Julio missing the second half of that game, not being himself, and then Ridley being a decoy. Now with Ridley back and hopefully Julio getting back soon, Zacchaeus probably kind of turns back into dust. At tight end, Hayden Hurst had just 2 receptions for 8 yards this week. It wasn't a terrible week, though, in the underlying stats. He had a 17% target share. He was targeted on 19% of his routes. So it was kind of like a better day than it looked. But on the season, Hurst is still at just a target per route run of 15%. And so not really a guy that I'm that excited about. It's just this week would maybe you just completely lose confidence in him. But I actually think that, compared to the rest of the season, this week was fine. In Baltimore, Mark Ingram had both running back carries inside the 10 this week, but only had 6.2 expected points. Gus Edwards actually led the running backs in snaps this week with 40%. Mark Ingram had 30%. J.K. Dobbins had 29%. So I went back and I was looking at this because I was actually assuming that, the Ravens, they won this game in a blowout. And you would think that this was due to that game script, but Mark Ingram actually played the last series that Baltimore had on offense. And so I don't know that that's really the case. It looks like this might just be a true three-man committee right now. I think all three of these guys should be owned in like FFPC type of leagues. If this were to get down to two guys, then it would be pretty interesting. At wide receiver, Marquise Brown ran a route on 95% of dropbacks. That's up from 81% last week. He had a 28% target share and a 44% air yard share while targeted on 24% of his routes. 24% targets per route run is pretty impressive given that his ADOT was 14.1. This is a deep threat getting peppered with targets. Brown has not put this all together yet for a blow-up week, but I really do feel that he is going to deliver a monster week. He has all of the underlying metrics that would support a huge week. It would be nice to see Baltimore in a position where they kind of need to go to him. There's more offensive passing volume throughout the entire game. But even with just kind of simple variance, I think Brown could have a monster week coming up here. Last week, I thought that Devin Duvernay was potentially eating into Miles Boykin's role. Wasn't sure if they were necessarily going to be splitting time, or maybe we would see Willie Snead's role come down this week. But this week, I think, confirms what we were suspecting. Boykin and Devin Duvernay are splitting time. Miles Boykin was again below 60% route per drop back. Duvernay was above 30% again. Both guys aren't fantasy viable right now, but at this point, I would probably bet on Duvernay's role to continue increasing. He looks pretty interesting. Obviously, they just drafted him, and now Boykin's role is starting to come down. So maybe Boykin holds him off for a few more weeks, but keep your eye on Devin Duvernay. At tight end, Mark Andrews finally had a good game this week in the underlying stats that then actually translated to a strong fantasy day as well. He ran a route on 85% of dropbacks. He was targeted on 27% of his routes. He had a 25% target share, a 30% air yard share. So a really nice day in the underlying stats here. One thing that I haven't talked about with Andrews actually is that even though I have talked quite a bit about his targets per route run, particularly last year where he has the highest targets per route run of any tight end in the PFF database going back to 2006. I mentioned that several times, but it looks even more impressive when you consider that last year he had an ADOT of 11. So I mentioned earlier in this episode that like if a guy has a really deep ADOT, then getting targeted, like Marquise Brown, we're seeing he's getting targeted on a really high rate, even though he's running really deep routes and getting really deep targets. That's even more impressive. If a guy has an ADOT of like 3 and then he's getting targeted on a really high rate of his routes, that's not as impressive. Basically the value of air yards here, right? So most tight ends, they don't run very deep routes. Most tight end ADOTs are like around 8 or 9, or sometimes even more shallow. Like you're seeing with Evan Ingram this year, he's like down at like 4, 5, 6 each week. Mark Andrews is used a bit deeper. Last year he was at 11, and we're seeing something similar this year. Actually, his ADOTs even increased this year to 12.3. He's still being targeted on 23% of his routes, which is an elite rate for a tight end. And again, tight ends typically used more shallow. So that ADOT is just another point I wanted to mention with Andrews here, is something that adds to his ceiling. He's getting targeted at a very high rate for a tight end, but he's also running deeper routes than a tight end. And so his weekly ceiling is really nice. It also probably does add some volatility, that higher than usual ADOT. And also the Ravens offense being a bit more low volume even than last year is tough. But Andrews does have the 4th highest Whopper among tight ends this season, so he is getting strong volume overall. In Carolina, Mike Davis continues to operate as a true workhorse with 83% of snaps, 25.3 expected points this week. I mean, both those are elite numbers. He is just a total workhorse. I don't know at this point, like, if his domination of touches is good for Christian McCaffrey. Like, you could say it's good, right? Because this is a team that clearly wants to use one back, and McCaffrey goes down, they just make Davis the one back. And then once McCaffrey comes back, he's obviously going to play ahead of Davis, and It's all systems go. But it might not be good for McCaffrey, given that Davis has played very well. The team clearly trusts him. So, I mean, what are you going to do? Like, you're going to play McCaffrey. But I guess, if you have Davis, there's some chance that he retains some value, I would say, especially in the beginning, I think, because they're going to, I would assume, given how Davis has played, they'll want to work McCaffrey back somewhat slowly. So it does look like we'll get one more week of Davis before McCaffrey's back, and then maybe we'll get a few weeks of him in kind of a committee role as McCaffrey gets back to full health. At wide receiver, this was a statement week from Robbie Anderson, who's actually outscored in fantasy points by DJ Moore, but look at him on the chart here. He's got a 37% target share this week. He accounted for 49% of the air yards. His Whopper was 0.9. He ran a route on just 85% of dropbacks. I say just, I mean, that's a lot, but it's not like it was 100 to get this level of, he's half of the team's air yards basically, and he's not even out there for 100% of routes. He's now the wide receiver 6 in Whopper on the season. I think this was the week for guys like me that were kind of thinking that, okay, yeah, Moore's being used on more of the deep routes. He's going to be more volatile, but we're a lot more confident in the talent level with Moore than Anderson. This is the week where we really need to start taking Robbie Anderson seriously. He did have a strong week, but, DJ Moore also had a strong week, so maybe it kind of masked this a little bit. But Anderson really looking like the true wide receiver 1 in this offense right now. I'd had it more as like Anderson the 1A, Moore the 1B, but in the underlying stats, this was really kind of a coming out party for Robbie Anderson. DJ Moore, like I said, did have a good game, especially in the box score, but he had just a 14% target share in this game, 32% air yard share. So kind of the same stuff with Moore, where he's getting targeted less frequently. He is getting targeted pretty deep downfield, but that's not necessarily the guy that we are excited about in a Teddy Bridgewater offense. His ADOT, I say pretty deep downfield, his ADOT is 13.1 to Anderson's 9.1. So significant difference there, and Moore operating as like a true deep threat in this offense. As we look ahead, I think Moore could have a rough time against the Bears this week. This is a game where we might expect Bridgewater to get the ball out quickly. And so, again, I think favoring Anderson as we move forward, and especially this next game, I think. On the season, Robbie Anderson's Whopper is 0.67 to Moore's 0.6. So, maybe we should still say that these guys are 1A and 1B with Anderson 1A and Moore 1B. But, I just think that with the ADOT being what it is, with the fit with Teddy Bridgewater, I do think that Anderson, despite the Whoppers actually still being pretty close on the season, I think Anderson's the wide receiver 1 in this offense, and Moore's kind of more the wide receiver 2. I actually, this is one of the things I'm going to be thinking about a lot this week for dynasty purposes of how to handle this, because Moore, his success at such an early age is really an elite company, and he's still having a pretty good season, like a 0.6 Whopper is a good season. We could potentially see this role shift a little bit over the course of the entire season, so I don't want to bail on Moore in dynasty, but this is definitely hurting his value. This is almost an exact flipping of what we would have expected going into the season, with Anderson kind of having this deep threat profile. At tight end, there's really nothing here. It's just a complete afterthought in this offense. Ian Thomas had just 1 target on 28 routes. Chris Manhertz wasn't targeted on 9 routes. This is actually why the tight end situation is why you don't need to panic on Moore, even if Anderson is emerging as the clear wide receiver 1 in this offense, because there is no tight end to steal workload or steal target share in this offense. It's really the 2 wide receivers, a little bit of Curtis Samuel, and Mike Davis or Christian McCaffrey, whoever's in the backfield. Moving to Chicago, David Montgomery. He looks like a true bell cow with Tariq Cohen out. Montgomery had 81% of the snaps and a workload of 16.7 points in what was a pretty tough matchup here against Tampa Bay. I think the most bullish aspect here on Montgomery is that he had 19% of the targets. So there's some concern, right, that Cordell Patterson would take a fair amount of those backfield type targets, those short targets. And he is involved somewhat, but Montgomery getting 19% of targets, I think, alleviates concerns that he wouldn't see his role grow substantially. Montgomery looks like a smash this upcoming week against the Panthers. Even if that game kind of turns more into like a shootout, Montgomery's target share should keep him heavily involved, and then he can be probably very efficient on the ground. At wide receiver, Allen Robinson had a 38% target share and a 46% air yard share. He ran a route on 91% of dropbacks. The next most involved Bears wide receiver here was Darnell Mooney. He ran a route on 73% of dropbacks and had a 12% target share. So Allen Robinson just has a huge moat between him and the next guy who, is this tiny little rookie wide receiver. Just a dominant alpha wide receiver, Allen Robinson. He's wide receiver 5 in Whopper on the season. Mooney has now run a route on over 70% of dropbacks in consecutive weeks. He does look like the clear wide receiver 2 in this offense. Nice development for him as kind of this unheralded rookie. Anthony Miller's routes had been trending up over the last few weeks, but he was actually at a season low this week in routes run per dropback with just 44%. So things aren't looking great for Miller, with Mooney kind of, I think, pretty clearly the wide receiver 2, and Miller still operating just as a slot guy. I think the reason, why it's not so much Mooney stealing from Miller as the tight ends stealing from Miller, because when this team is in 2 tight end sets, which it is a fair amount, Miller's not typically on the field. And so Cole Kmet, who's come on a little bit this week, I think ate into Miller's role a bit. Kmet ran a route on 20% of dropbacks. He was not targeted, so that's not great. As someone who was excited about Kmet as a prospect, it's been pretty slow going here, but he was out there on 20% of dropbacks at least this week, so baby steps. Jimmy Graham ran a route on 80% of dropbacks, but he was targeted on just 14% of his routes. On the season, he's been targeted just 16%. He does have 4 touchdowns, though. Another one in this game. The touchdown equity, is going to keep him in starting consideration. If you need kind of a dart throw at tight end, you can do worse than Jimmy Graham. In Cincinnati, Joe Mixon played on 76% of snaps and had an elite workload of 22.8 points. He underperformed that by 7.4 points, but the usage is very bullish considering this was a poor game script. And, he had a 28% target share in this game. So this makes the case, I think, that with 76% of snaps, 28% target share, Mixon can be considered, I think, a true workhorse running back going forward. At least this week, that's what this week would kind of make the case for. Pretty exciting development for Mixon. A little bit undercover because he was so inefficient, but obviously we just saw in the previous week, in week 4, him blow up. So we know Mixon is capable of very efficient outings. And so maybe people, this is more of a DFS take really, but might not realize that Mixon's now coming off 2 very strong weeks. At wide receiver, last week I said AJ Green was in the process of getting passed by T. Higgins. That process is complete. Tyler Boyd and T. Higgins had identical 4 for 62 receiving lines, but Higgins was considerably more involved. Higgins had a 28% target share to Boyd's 21%, a 41% air yard share to Boyd's 30%. Higgins led all Bengals players with a route on 92% of dropbacks. He slowly worked his way into a bigger and bigger role. I think at this point, it's really going to be a battle between him and Tyler Boyd of who is the wide receiver 1 in this offense. As for AJ Green, he suffered a hamstring injury in this game. He may miss a few weeks, but he was only targeted on 5% of his routes this week. So even before going down, He was not really involved in that offense. I don't think that this will affect the offense all that much to not have AJ Green, as T. Higgins, who was kind of taking over that role, and it kind of finished taking it over anyway. At tight end, we've got Drew Sample here. He ran a route on 69% of dropbacks, but targeted on just 7% of his routes. He's at just 13% for the year, and doesn't look like a very serious threat in the receiving game. In Cleveland, Kareem Hunt played on 70% of snaps this week after just 35% last week. We knew that his snaps were going to increase. Nick Chubb had averaged 54% of snaps over the first 3 weeks, so we knew that him going down last week would open up a lot of opportunity for Hunt, but it was still impressive to see Hunt up at 70% this week. Yeah, I think it indicates that Dearness Johnson's pretty heavy involvement in week 4 was driven in part by Hunt still working back from an ankle injury. Hunt also had an elite workload in this game in terms of expected points with 20.8 expected points, just 6.1 for Johnson. Dontrell Hilliard, who, there was some concern he would be involved. He did not play an offensive snap. So I think Hunt looks like a great play going forward. Johnson looks more like a flex fill-in type. At wide receiver, Odell Beckham had a fairly quiet week in week 5. His opportunity was down a bit in the underlying metrics. He had a 24% target share, 21% air yard share. He ran a route, though, on a team-high 93% of dropbacks, and he still had healthy receiving volume, just not massive receiving volume. Baker Mayfield had a rib injury in this game, but he doesn't look like he's going to miss time. So I think Odell remains a strong weekly option. Jarvis Landry, he saw his route percentage actually tick down a bit. He was at 85% of dropbacks last week, ran around on 80% this week. But he did set season highs in target share at 24% and air yard share at 33%. At this point, I think Jarvis Landry kind of looks like Jarvis Landry again. He's not necessarily going to be out there in the coming weeks on like 95% of routes or 95% of dropbacks or anything, but he is now getting targeted at a pretty high rate, and he's been out there at least in terms of, that 80%, 85% range of routes run per dropback now for several weeks. So I think Landry's kind of worked back into form, and I feel better about him going forward. At tight end, Austin Hooper, he had a fantastic week in the underlying stats. He ran a route on 70% of dropbacks, was targeted on 32% of his routes, which is great. He had a 26% target share, 30% air yard share. This was actually with Harrison Bryant and David Njoku both active. Each ran routes on 25% of dropbacks. For the season, Austin Hooper is now at a 22% tipper, target per route run, and a 19% target share. He looks like a legitimate tight end 1 option. I was very skeptical of Austin Hooper headed into the season. Changing teams, was not targeted at a high rate in Atlanta's offense. He's now dealing with Njoku. Harrison Bryant was looking interesting. So, I think that I'm revising my opinion on Hooper, particularly for this season. I'm still a little bit skeptical over what he's done, over his entire career. So I'm not necessarily going to be sending offers for him in Dynasty, but, he only had a 5.9 yards per target this week. He only went 5 for 57 in this game. So I think, especially for like more short-term considerations, he should be pretty cheap in redraft leagues. I think that, in DFS, maybe he won't be all that popular. This week it's tough because he goes against the Steelers in week 6, but he does get the Bengals in week 7. And I also say, if he really struggles, if the whole offense struggles in week 6 and Hooper's like very cheap in Dynasty at that point, and he's coming up in a good matchup and you need a tight end and you can kind of steal him, then I'm all for that. In Dallas, oh man, we lost Dak Prescott this week to that brutal ankle injury. Obviously a huge blow to the entire NFL, to anyone who loves watching great quarterback play. It was a real bummer. He was having an awesome season. So hope Dak gets back healthy as soon as possible. Ezekiel Elliott played 82% of snaps. He had a strong workload this week of 18.5 points. He did lose 8.2 expected points to Tony Pollard. Pollard played on 23% of snaps, He was at 27%, 27% last week. So nice little increase here for Tony Pollard, because over the first 3 weeks, he averaged just 10% of snaps. Now he's been right around 25% for 2 weeks. Does seem to be a slightly bigger factor in the offense than he was before. And he's been especially involved as a receiver with 9% target share to Zeke's 6%. Obviously, we're not going to see like a changing the guard here. This is Zeke's backfield. But, I think with this offense about to take a big step back and how potent it's going to be, Zeke losing some of this opportunity to Pollard is not a good sign. Definitely something that we need to be aware of in the coming weeks. At wide receiver, Amari Cooper ran around on 71% of dropbacks, setting a new season low. He was rotated out some for Noah Brown and Cedric Wilson last week, and that continued this week as well. When the season kicked off, Amari Cooper was out there for close to 100% of routes. So this has been trending down now for a while. He also saw just a 12% target share and a 9% air yard share. Not a good week for Amari Cooper. Obviously not a reason to panic. But on its own, but then we also add in the context that we've got the quarterback change. So a little bit concerning for Amari Cooper. I think he was, with the signs in terms of his workload, running less routes, getting less targets, and now with the quarterback not likely going to be able to support as many passing game options as Dak was. This is all not good for Cooper. Hopefully he'll bounce back here, but he's about to become a lot more of a shaky option, I think. Michael Gallup ran a route on 100% of dropbacks in this game, but he had just 12% of the targets. The thing about Gallup is that unlike Amari Cooper, he was targeted deep downfield. He had a 17.2 ADOT. He managed 29% of air yards. It'll be interesting to see if his role is adjusted at all now with Andy Dalton. Dalton obviously not a great deep passer. If not, it could be, even more frustrating to have Gallup, as he's got this clear deep threat role. 17.2 ADOT is quite deep. CeeDee Lamb, I might need to start with CeeDee Lamb next week, because he's starting to look like the wide receiver one in this offense. He still not out there for a full slate of routes. Only ran a route on 71% of dropbacks, same as Cooper. But he dominated targets, 33% of targets, 57% of air yards. I mean, that's pretty wild, given the competition that he has, especially, as I said, with Gallup, he being a true deep threat, and yet CeeDee Lamb is able to dominate air yards like that, 57%. Lamb was targeted on an absurd 44% of his routes. He had a yards per route run of 4.96, which, is just ungodly. He should be taken as a serious threat to emerge as the top option in this offense going forward. I think he's not the favorite, but, what he's doing is very impressive. Dalton Schultz ran a route on 80% of his dropbacks. He was targeted on just 11% of his routes. This is now 3 straight weeks where he's been targeted below 20% of his routes, consecutive weeks below 15%. He's now, with his targets per route run on the season is 19%. This offense just took a big hit. He's far less interesting than he was just a few weeks ago. Lamb is the guy that really jumped out this week. I think we can feel decently confident in Cooper, just given what he's shown for the season. I'm pretty worried about Schultz, and I'm pretty worried about Gallup if he doesn't start running a little bit more shallow routes. Moving on to the Texans, David Johnson is not listed in Pro Football Reference snap data for some reason. But it looks like he was in the 70% snap range based on Duke Johnson running 29% of snaps. David Johnson had a mediocre 13.4 expected point workload. Duke Johnson had a 2.7 point workload. So this was kind of more of the offensive environment, although obviously this was not a tough matchup here with Jacksonville. So not necessarily a great sign for David Johnson that his workload was so small. Wasn't super small, but against Jacksonville, had almost the entire backfield worth of expected points. Not great. At wide receiver, Brandon Cooks had a statement game. He ran a route on 89% of dropbacks and was targeted on 32% of his routes. He had a 34% target share, 37% air yard share. He now leads the Texans in routes run per dropback. He leads Texans in target share and in Whopper as well. We just saw him in week 4 completely disappoint us. That can always happen, but he does have some nice weekly upside. Will Fuller ran a route on 87% of dropbacks with a target on 24% of his routes for a 23% target share and a 36% air yard share. He's operating deeper downfields than Cooks on the season. He has an ADOT of 13.4 to Cooks 11.3. That's how he's leading in air yards despite just a 90% target share on the season. Fuller, he may profile kind of as the wide receiver 2 in this offense after this week, but his targets per route run of 19.7 to Cooks 18.5 while operating deeper downfield than Cooks, I think kind of makes, I think that the idea that Fuller's somehow the wide receiver 2 after this week, a bit of a mirage. I think Fuller's still getting targeted while operating deeper downfield at a higher rate. He's also dealt with some injuries, so the target share could be a little bit misleading. I think going to this per target statistic with Fuller makes a lot of sense, just because he's been kind of in and out a little bit. So I do think that he's the primary option still in this offense, although definitely a very nice week for Brandon Cooks. At tight end, with Jordan Akins out, Darren Fells ran a route on 63% of dropbacks, but was targeted on just 8% of his routes. One of those was a 44-yard touchdown, which saved his day. But Fells has actually been targeted at a decently high rate when on the field, and then Akins is out and his targets per out run falls way off. It's not necessarily a huge shock because Fells kind of had this red zone role where they were looking for him there, but he's an older player, not someone we were thinking was like about to have this imminent breakout. It does seem like the Texans may have played slowly overall in this game. I'm going to be paying close attention to what Pat Thorman has to say about them in his Pace article this week. Doesn't seem like there was all that much offensive volume here, which would be a concern not just for David Johnson, as I mentioned earlier, but also for Fuller, Cooks, and everybody. Moving to Indianapolis. Jonathan Taylor got over 50% of the snaps for the first time since week 2. He had 55% of the snaps in this game. Nyheim Hines was at 38%. He's been at 33% or above for the last 3 weeks. He definitely has a pretty nice role in this offense. Jordan Wilkins fell off this week to just 4%. He got just 2 snaps. He was at 28% in week 3. Wilkins was down to 17% last week, and now this week down to just 4%. So it looks like maybe this backfield is now reducing to just Taylor and Nyheim Hines. And if so, then both players become a lot easier to trust. Wilkins, I think, is someone that you can churn back into the waiver wire. Just getting, 4% of snaps this weekend doesn't necessarily have huge contingent value. I think he would operate as, kind of a 2-down grinder type, even if Taylor were to go down. If Nyheim Hines were to go down, I'm not even sure how much bigger Wilkins' role would be compared to where it was at in like week 3. Taylor and Hines were both involved in the receiving game, kind of to the point of Hines going down, I think would really help Taylor, maybe not so much Wilkins. Hines had a 12% target share. Taylor had a 9% target share in this game. Taylor had 13.7 expected points this week, and Hines had 7. The backfield wasn't valuable enough this week to fully support this split workload, but they get the Bengals next week, so things could improve. This could be an interesting week for, if you have Hines as a flex option or a zero running back RB2 type. I think he's definitely interesting this week, and it could be a nice week for Taylor potentially. Hopefully Wilkins will continue to not be involved very much. At wide receiver, T.Y. Hilton had a 6 for 69 line this week. And he was impressively involved considering the team had only 34 dropbacks. His 10 targets were good for a 31% target share this week. He had 111 air yards, which was good for 42% of the air yards this week. So he's a clear go-to option, but not a strong outing for the passing game. So it's like, it was good to see Hilton having this strong target share, air yard share. You see him on the chart here. He's kind of all alone here in the top right where we want guys to be, but concerning week for the passing game as a whole. Zach Pascal ran a route on 94% of dropbacks. That tied with Hilton for first, but he was targeted on just 6% of his routes and managed just a 6% target share. He was not targeted downfield and had an ADOT of minus 1.5 this week. Not a good week for Pascal. At tight end, Trey Burton is the tight end 1A here. It looked like that might be the case last week. Last week, he led tight ends in routes run per dropback and had a targets per route run of 29%, which is good. This week, he continued that trend. He ran a route on 53% of dropbacks to Doyle's 47%. Burton saw a target on 33% of his routes, while Doyle had a target on just 13% of his. Doyle is at a targets per route run of 9.1% on the season. I think he can be dropped in pretty much all formats. He's basically a contingent tight end play at this point. He also has Mo Cox there, who I also think is probably better than Jack Doyle at this point. Trey Burton's targets per route run is 31.4% through 2 games. And I think we could see his routes run per dropback rate increase over the coming weeks. So he's someone that if you can add cheaply still in like non-tight end premium, I would do that. If he's available in any FFPC leagues, I would definitely pounce on him. We were able to stash him in a few leagues last week, but he should be 100% owned. Moving to Jacksonville. After logging 76% of snaps last week, James Robinson was down to just 57% this week. Definitely a disappointing outcome since last week, the Jaguars were also trailing for much of that game. Robinson had 7 targets and a 16% target share this week. So he does have the type of role in the offense that can benefit from negative game script, but those scripts, I think, also put him at risk of a reduced snap count. And that's what we saw this week. Only Chris Thompson is getting offensive snaps at running back right now outside of Robinson. So it's like hurry up situations, them being down by a bunch of points where they just leave Thompson out there for a while where they know they're going to pass. That's the thing that really hurt Robinson here. He still had 15.9 expected points, which is a strong workload, especially given the snap count. And so, yeah, he can still have elite weeks. He's someone that, and I think it's tough because he's involved in the receiving game a lot, which is great. He can be quite valuable even in negative scripts, but it's also a bummer to see that in those negative scripts, he can be pulled off the field entirely for long stretches as well. So kind of a bit volatile, but he's not totally game script dependent. I think especially in like shootout scripts where they're still trying to run the ball a little bit, they can leave Robinson out there for all downs if they want to. At wide receiver, DJ Chark left this game with an ankle injury. Surprisingly, he was only targeted on 11% of his routes, which, not great. So even before he was hurt, not being targeted heavily, obviously small sample, just a portion of one game. But we really only have the one game last week where he's operated as a true alpha. When he's cleared to play again, I wouldn't be opposed to shopping him around at all, especially in redraft. Obviously in Dynasty, I do think he's a talented young player. Don't want to sell low on him, but a little bit concerned about his role. It does look like this offense is going to spread the ball around a fair amount, and we have Laviska Shenault coming on here, and Laviska's for real. He led the team with an 18% target share, despite running a route on only 69% of dropbacks. He continues to be targeted at a very high rate. His target per route run of 21% for this week, and he's at 21% for the season as well. He also saw a green zone target out of the backfield this week. That was nice to see, especially with Robinson being a better than expected receiver and Robinson playing really well this year. I started to get a little bit more bearish on how much we might see Laviska out of the backfield, especially around the goal line. So even though it didn't really lead to anything, it was nice to see him in that role for that play. And Laviska is playing more as the season goes on. Even though he was only in on 69% of dropbacks, he could go up. I would love to see him in like the 85% range. He is increasing as the season progresses, and the 69% was a season high. At tight end, Tyler Eifert left the game in the third quarter, and so he only ran around on 60% of dropbacks. He was targeted on 18% of his routes. He still doesn't really look like a strong option going forward. James O'Shaughnessy replaced Eifert, and on the season, he now is being targeted on 21.2% of his routes, on 66 routes. I think he actually looks somewhat interesting if he were to get a bigger role at any point. Eifert struggling to get targeted at a high rate. But this offense does seem like it's going to spread the ball around. So, O'Shaughnessy is just kind of a deep name to monitor. In Kansas City, Clyde Edwards-Helaire had a 60% snap count in this game. Darrell Williams had 40%. Definitely this was surprising, right? Because if anything, we thought Williams was dust. It looks like, they brought up DeAndre Washington from the practice squad late last week. We thought that maybe Washington was going to be the guy that we wanted to have as the handcuff type to Edwards-Helaire. But Washington wasn't even active in this game, healthy scratch. And so to see Williams getting a significant workload, 8.9 expected points, was definitely a surprise. CEH did have a strong workload still. He got 17.4 expected points, but does stink that he lost that 8.9 to Williams. Definitely kind of hurt his output in this game. Both backs left a lot on the field this week. Edwards-Helaire finished 6.4 points below expectations, and Williams was also 4 points below his expected points. CEH did remain a big part of the passing game this week at least. He had a 19% target share. So that was the nice thing. The snap count was weird. Williams was not good, so I'm not really even sure what to make of that. Hopefully we see Edwards-Helaire's snaps bounce back up next week. In Las Vegas, I'm sorry. We still got to do the wide receivers here. At wide receiver, Sammy Watkins injured his hamstring, and he could be out a few weeks. Tyreek Hill had a ridiculously deep ADOT in this game of 30.7. He was able to get 45% of the air yards with just 14% of the targets. Just really, really deep this week. Obviously, that'll bounce around a little bit, but I think that kind of explains a little bit of the variance we saw here with Hill. Mecole Hardman set a season high with 71% route run per drop back. His ADOT was weirdly low. He was actually negative, minus 2.3. So I'm not loving the fact that with that low ADOT, he was targeted on just 8% of his routes. Although, I don't know. We don't know where he wasn't targeted. So maybe he was running a lot of deep routes that he wasn't targeted on. And then he was getting targeted when he was getting targeted basically behind the line of scrimmage. So, Hardman should be seeing more playing time now here. And it was a good sign that he set a career high here with Watkins leaving the game, a season high at least, with 71% routes run per dropback. But would really like to see him getting targeted at a higher rate. At tight end, Travis Kelce dominated this game, 29% target share, 26% air yard share. He ran around on 86% of his dropbacks and targeted on 27% of his routes. Now, too much to say, Travis Kelce is elite. You can see him on the chart here, profiling like an elite wide receiver one. In Las Vegas, Josh Jacobs saw 60% of snaps, down slightly from his 4-week average of 68%. Did have a nearly elite workload, however, of 18.4 expected points, and was efficient on that workload with 4.1 points over expectations. It was disappointing to see him with just a 10% target share to Jalen Richard's 17%, however. And Richard siphoned off 7.9 points and really took what could have been a huge game for Jacobs off the table. Jacobs is involved in the receiving game to some degree, but to see Richard getting that 17% target share, 7.9 expected points, it's tough. It's tough for Jacobs. At wide receiver, Henry Ruggs was a pure deep threat in this game. He had an 8 out of 30.7. He got 34% of the air yards on just 3 targets in this game. Definitely great to see him back healthy, and hopefully he'll start to see more of a mix of route types. He's not going to be a fun start if he's in the 20s or above 30 like he was in this game in ADOT. Hunter Renfrow led all wide receivers with a 14% target share, which is not high, and really shows you that the wide receivers here were not targeted much in this game. overall because they have Darren Waller, who's basically a wide receiver one playing tight end. He ran a route on 87% of dropbacks, which is really high for tight end, targeted on 27.1% of his routes, also very, very high. 28% target share, 22% air yard share. He only went 5 for 48 for 1 in this game, but really could have been a huge day for Darren Waller. Continues to operate as the wide receiver one in this offense, even with Ruggs back. Ruggs dominating air yards with the high ADOT, as I said, but Waller kind of operating more as like the alpha wide receiver one. Moving to Los Angeles Chargers. Man, I expected Joshua Kelly to play clearly ahead of Justin Jackson here. Jackson was not really involved much as a receiver last year, not involved on the goal line. I thought Kelly's skill set would kind of better fit a lead back type of role, but that is not what happened. Jackson played 59% of the snaps to Kelly's 35%. And more importantly, Jackson saw 15.7 expected points to Kelly's 6.6. What was the difference here? The passing game. Jackson was not used all that much as a receiver, just 11 targets in 7 games last year. This is why I was pretty skeptical of him. But he ran a route on 50% of dropbacks last night, and he was targeted 6 times. It's a big deal. He has 8 targets now this week and last week. So he's almost got more than he had all of last season in 7 games. So it's pretty exciting if you have Jackson. You're able to get him for fab. I did come around to, prioritizing him over like Dearness Johnson, but ultimately I was still too skeptical, I think. He should be he looks like someone who's going to pretty easily pay off those like low 200 type of fab bids if he can maintain this role. Because the other thing about Jackson is that he was used in some short yardage third down situations. So it's possible that he could be ending up get some usage around the goal line. That wasn't the case in this game. The silver lining for Kelly is that he was getting those snaps inside the 10-yard line. And he had at least one nice run from the 10-yard line. He got a little bit unlucky where there were some penalties, sacks, screw-ups type of stuff that I think kept him from he didn't obviously have a touchdown in this game, but he did have some decent opportunity, at least in terms of being on the field in those situations. So I do think that we could see the expected points swing at least closer to more like a 50-50 split, because Kelly, I do think, is still a favorite to get that goal line work. But like I said, seeing Jackson on that short yardage third down work makes me think that it's not like they don't think Jackson couldn't be used in that role. If he has a big run down to the 2-yard line or something, I don't know that he immediately gets subbed out for Kelly. If he's already out on the field, maybe they just keep him in for that role. We'll have to see. Overall, very bullish. For Jackson, I'm still holding out hope for Kelly to score us some touchdowns. At wide receiver, Keenan Allen was in for a huge game before leaving with a back injury. He was on pace for 38% of the targets before going down. He's got a bye week now. And I think, for DFS purposes, it seems like people were maybe not realizing just how huge a part of the offense he had become. Then he shows it off again. He gets in the end zone, but then he blew, if you had him in the captain or whatever, like he blew up your lineup. Now he's going on bye. He gets the Jaguars in week 7. So Keenan Allen, keep him in mind. I think when he comes back in week 7, it could be really, really nice. Mike Williams, nice to see him take advantage of Allen's absence. He blew up later in the game. He had a 25% target share, 42% air yard share. He ran a route on 82% of dropbacks. If Allen does end up missing any time with this back injury, I think Mike Williams becomes pretty interesting. At tight end, Hunter Henry ran a route on 82% of dropbacks and was targeted on 23% of routes. For the season now, he has a target per route run of 21.2%. He's running a route on 81% of dropbacks. Just a very reliable tight end option now. I think he should have some spike weeks in the weeks ahead. At, the Los Angeles Rams, at running back, Darrell Henderson led the backfield with 43% of snaps. Malcolm Brown had 38%, and then Cam Akers was down at 19%. If we look at the expected points, it looks like this was Henderson's backfield. He had 18.8 expected points. Brown had 7, and Akers had 4.3. I'm skeptical of that, though, because This backfield remains highly in flux. I think the snaps are probably more reliable here, better indicator than the expected points. It's not like Darrell Henderson has locked in the key, has this big moat for goal line work or receiving work or something. We could see these guys being used interchangeably every week. So I think the snaps is really the thing to pay attention to here. You're still seeing Akers looking, like the third guy, but Malcolm Brown's still up at 38%. Pretty scary if you're wanting to rely on Henderson after a strong game this week. He is someone that I think is extremely fragile. At wide receiver, Robert Woods led the way in routes. He ran a route on 91% of dropbacks. He had 31% of air yards as well, which is nice. Cooper Kupp, though, led the way in terms of targets with 28%, and he had a 0.6 whopper, which led. He looks like the wide receiver 1A here right now. Woods kind of more the 1B. Josh Reynolds ran a route on 72% of dropbacks and is basically a full-time player now after kind of looking at one point like he might be getting phased out by Van Jefferson. Van Jefferson only ran nine routes in this game and was not targeted at all. So Reynolds seems to have taken his job back and is now basically a full-time player. At tight end, Tyler Higbee again led the team in routes per dropback, which is something he's done every single week this year. He ran a route on 47% of dropbacks. Gerald Everett actually saw a major hit to his routes run. He ran 44% on 44% of dropbacks last week. He was only running around on 22% of dropbacks this week. So in terms of, the opportunity to run routes, not a bad week for Higbee, very bad week for Everett. However, Everett was targeted on 57% of his routes, and he put up a 4 for 90 line. So very, very nice week for Everett in the box score, especially compared to our expectations. And also, just in terms of getting targeted at a very high rate on his routes, Higbee was targeted on just 13%. On the season, Higbee leads slightly in targets per route run with 18.8% to 18.4%. But Higbee does have a significant lead in routes run. He's running around on 52% of dropbacks to Everett's 30%. To me, what this week said is that if Higbee were to miss time, Everett would be an awesome tight end one type of play. He would be a guy you could immediately plug into your lineups, be a great play in FFPC, tight end premium. However, if Higbee and Everett are both out on the field, I think they're going to continue to cannibalize each other. And Higbee remains, I think, the stronger play unless we see next week that the routes change, because Higbee is running, 52% of dropbacks to 30%. That's significant. And even this week when, Everett kind of had this potential breakout week, Everett only ran a route on 22% of dropbacks compared to 47 for Higbee. So the gap actually widened this week. So this is kind of frustrating because I think both these guys are legitimate players, and I would really like to see them each get an opportunity. But right now, they're both kind of cannibalizing each other. So something to keep your eye on going forward. But I'm basically not buying into Everett as startable right now, unless he gets more drop. I mean, if you felt strongly that he would get more routes next week, then he probably would be because he's getting targets at a pretty high rate. But that's the part I'm skeptical of. Moving on to the Miami Dolphins. At running back, Jordan Howard was a healthy scratch for this game, and Myles Gaskin had 63% of the snaps. Matt Breida had 31%. Gaskin had an elite workload in this game of 21.7 expected points, did leave 1.6 points on the field. Breida had a workload of 5.9 points. So nice showing from Gaskin. Really kind of bullish that Jordan Howard was a healthy scratch, right? Because that was the thing. At first, it seemed like Jordan Howard was just going to steal all the touchdowns. Then it seemed like maybe he'd only steal some of them. And now with a healthy scratch, Gaskin really does have a chance to get these elite workloads again. I don't know that this was necessarily a fluke. At wide receiver, Devontae Parker ran a route on 100% of dropbacks, but had just 11% of targets and 17% of air yards. Preston Williams led all wide receivers in targets this week with 19%. He led the team in air yards with 41%, ran a route on 81% of dropbacks. Isaiah Ford ran a route on 65% of dropbacks, only targeted on 10% of his routes. So it's basically a Preston Williams week at wide receiver, but it was really a Mike Gesicki week, who had a very strong game. He ran a route on 81% of dropbacks with targets per route run of 24%. He led the team with 22% of targets and was second in air yards with 19%. When you look at like the targets per route run for tight ends, which I really think is important, on the season, he still kind of looks borderline. He's at 19.1%. He's running a route on 73% of dropbacks, which is nice. But that 19.1% isn't great. It is up significantly from where he was last year, though. And then the other thing with Gesicki that I'm realizing is that I think we need to give him credit for his high ADOT. I talked about this earlier with Mark Andrews, and among tight ends with 20 plus targets, Gesicki trails only Mark Andrews in ADOT. So I do think that Gesicki is someone that I was skeptical of his ceiling going into the season, and I think in particular I was too low on his weekly ceiling because he does have this high ADOT. He is running a lot of routes, and his targets per route run has moved up substantially from where it was last year. So he has shown a nice development there, moving from like 15.5% now up to 19%. With that high ADOT, we can start to see some really nice spike weeks from Gesicki. Obviously, that's going to create some volatility as well. But I think at tight end, like, the volatility is baked in. We know we're getting the volatility. What we want is a guy who can deliver some spike week upside, and Gesicki now looking like that guy. In Minnesota, Dalvin Cook injured his groin. He could miss several weeks. Alexander Mattison ended up playing 49% of the snaps. Mike Boone played just 6%. Mattison also had a workload of 16.5 points. On top of Dalvin Cook having a workload of 15.2 expected points, the two combined for a superstar level expected point workload of 31.7, and the two combined ceded just a total of 3.8 points to CJ Ham and Mike Boone. So Mattison looking like a potential workhorse, a true bell cow if we have an extended absence here from Dalvin Cook. And Mattison is in an awesome spot next week facing the Falcons. So, I don't know. I haven't looked at the pricing yet for DFS. Obviously, ownership, all that. But, Mattison kind of jumps off the page, assuming he's priced fairly reasonably. At wide receiver, Adam Thielen had a huge week 5, 34% target share, 46% air yard share. He ran a route on 98% of dropbacks. This is not always going to be the case every week, but and we'd seen Justin Jefferson kind of have the pop-off week a couple weeks ago that hurt Thielen. But Thielen has weeks when this offense is moving, but it's moving mostly on the ground without him, because when it's moving through the air, he's accounting for basically half of the receiving game, which is absurd. And obviously that gives him huge upside. You can see him on the chart here, running 98%, a route on 98% of dropbacks. He's at 46% of the air yards, getting targeted on over 30% of his routes. True alpha wide receiver 1 right now. Justin Jefferson set a season high with a route on 95% of dropbacks. He has become a full-time player. That is what that type of breakout will do for you. You're going to become a full-time wide receiver in the offense when you do what Justin Jefferson has done already. He did not get targeted at a super high rate in this game, however, targeted on only 13% of routes for a 13% target share and a 20% air yard share. Obviously, he's a rookie. It's going to be a little volatile. He's got Adam Thielen to deal with, but Jefferson can play. At tight end, this was a promising game for Irv Smith in terms of his playing time. He ran a route on 74% of dropbacks to Kyle Rudolph's 57%, but Smith was targeted on just 13% of his routes. On the season, he's only been targeted on 10.8% of his routes. Irv Smith has a long way to go in terms of to where I would really consider him startable, except in like super deep formats. But he is running more routes, so that's good. Maybe he'll continue to run more routes and he can start earning targets at a little higher of a rate. Moving to New Orleans, Alvin Kamara played on 76% of snaps. He had a workload of 19 points. Not a massive game for Kamara, but I think we may be a little bit spoiled at this point. 19 points, still a very strong workload. Had a pretty good game overall. Latavius Murray played on 28% of snaps and had 6.6 expected points. Remains an elite handcuff. At wide receiver, Emmanuel Sanders really beginning to separate a little bit from the non-Michael Thomas options here. He will, I think, have a decent role when Thomas gets back. He had 30% of targets, 34% of air yards, and was targeted on 34% of his routes. I'm not sure, I don't think it'll necessarily hurt Thomas to have Sanders getting this, but certainly a guy like Traquan Smith becomes less interesting now with Thomas due back. He ran a route on 84% of dropbacks and had trouble earning targets. He had an 8 out of just 5, Traquan Smith, but he had a target per route run of 7%. So, when you are running really deep routes, it's all right if you're getting targeted a bit lower. If you're running really shallow routes and you're only getting targeted on 7% of your routes, which is really bad, it's not a good sign for your ability to earn targets. Traquan Smith is only at 12% for the season. His ADOT for the season is 7.7. So this is an ongoing problem with Traquan Smith. I think he's going to be irrelevant once Michael Thomas gets back. Jared Cook had a nice touchdown catch in this game, but was only targeted on 9% of his routes. He's at 15.8% for the season. I do think he'll struggle to find consistent value with both Thomas and Sanders on the field. Moving to the New York Giants, Devonta Freeman played on 54% of snaps, which is exactly where he was last week. Seems to be settling into that type of role. Deion Lewis had 29% of snaps and Wayne Gallman had 18%, which is also roughly where they were last week. Freeman had a more valuable workload of 13.6 points this week compared to last week. Obviously a better matchup this week. And I think this is probably maybe close to his ceiling workload unless he hits some good variance on goal line carries or unless he does continue to trend up in snaps. It looks like, maybe this week he's settling into this role, but who knows? Maybe after a couple of weeks of this, they feel comfortable moving him up in his snap count. If so, then he would obviously unlock some additional ceiling. At wide receiver, Darius Slayton is an alpha wide receiver 1. Slayton ran a route on 97% of dropbacks. He started on 32% of routes despite a deep ADOT of 13.2. 32% of his routes, he got a target running a route, getting targeted on average 13.2 yards downfield. That's really impressive. He had a 38% target share. He had 77% of the air yards this week. 77%. It's nuts. His Whopper was 1.11 this week, which basically breaks the Whopper metric. On the season, he's 4th in the NFL in air yard share. 4th in the NFL in air yard share this year. 11th in Whopper. With Washington on tap next, I think he could build on this week 5 production. He's looking really strong. It was nice because I was hoping he would have this breakout game when the schedule finally lightened up, and he was just absolutely dominant this week. Moving to Golden Tate, he had a 17% target share, 20% air yard share. Despite running a route on only 71% of dropbacks, I think he was limited a bit by the 2 tight end sets that the Giants were running. But even sure, I don't know why Tate, CJ Board, and Damian Ratley look to be playing ahead of him there. So not a great sign for Tate. I do think his ceiling is low, and this is Darius Slayton's passing offense right now. At tight end, Evan Ingram ran a route on 86% of dropbacks, but was targeted on just 7% of his routes. Given the matchup and his ADOT, which was 5, this was a rough showing for Evan Ingram. He has a targets per route run of just 16.4% for the season. He does run in an inordinately high number of routes for a tight end. He's run a route on 90% of dropbacks this year, so he can afford to get targeted at a lower rate because he runs a lot more routes than normal tight ends. But, he can't get targeted at this low of a rate, 7%. He's just not going to do anything with that. He does have a chance to rebound this week. Last week, he looked like heading into Dallas, maybe he was potentially entering an eruption spot. Didn't look as strong heading into that game as Slayton, but wouldn't have been shocked if I was sitting here today talking about how Slayton disappointed and Evan Ingram finally found a good game script for him. So, I don't want to give up on him too fast and does have a chance to rebound against Washington this week, but definitely a little bit concerning with the underlying metrics here for Evan Ingram and what could have been a nice game. Moving to the New York Jets. Le'Veon Bell was back and played a clear starter's level of snaps with 67% of the snaps in this game. Frank Gore handled the rest of the running back snaps with 33%. Bell had a nauseatingly small workload in this game of 8.1 points. Gore had 4.1. This backfield looks really gross, even with Bell back. Bell at least getting involved as a receiver, but it's gross. At wide receiver, I'd kind of written off Jeff Smith after last week as kind of a 1 week wonder type. He did have a 2.1 yards per target this week, real bad. So, maybe I was right to write him off, but he had 11 targets this week, which I did not see coming. And I did not think he would run a route on 100% of dropbacks, which he did. So I kind of do think the underlying metrics think I owe Jeff Smith an apology. He had 35% of targets, 44% of air yards. He had an elite whopper of 0.84. Now we have Chris Hogan likely out for week 6. Rashad Perriman still uncertain. So Smith, I think, is someone that we should take a bit seriously, particularly, as like a punt play in DFS, or, if you can get him very, very cheaply. He's definitely someone that looks really strong in his ability to earn targets. Wasn't a very strong prospect. Not super excited about his player profile, but now, 2 weeks in a row where he's kind of emerged this offense desperate for weapons. So Jeff Smith is someone that now I'm starting to be a little bit interested in. Jamison Crowder, you can see up here, ran a route on just above 80% of dropbacks. Not a huge air yard share, 22.4%. I think long-term, the wide receiver won in the offense, obviously, but going to be more expensive in every format, obviously, as well, than Jeff Smith. At tight end, okay, we've got this bit going a little bit about how much I read The Athletic. This is actually not a bit. I was grinding The Athletic last week. I was considering going to Chris Herndon in DFS, just thinking about it. What is there anything here? Can I go to him? And I actually was reading that there was on The Athletic, they were saying that they would not be surprised if Ryan Griffin had a bigger role this week, that they're starting to lose faith a little bit in Herndon. And that did keep me off of Herndon. Not that I should have ever really been thinking of being on him, but luckily the Athletic grinding saved me, because Herndon ran a route on just 41% of dropbacks to Griffin's 49%. Griffin was not targeted in this game, so it's not necessarily like someone you want to be all that interested in. But Herndon had a target per route run of 19%, which is not great. Not terrible, it's not great. And now his role is shrinking. So he looks like a pretty safe drop, even in FFPC, tight end premium leagues. You can pretty safely move on from Chris Herndon with his role now shrinking. Moving to the Eagles. Miles Sanders played on 85% of snaps. That's up from 77% last week. Sanders had 16.6 expected points this week. That's good. It's not great. We'd like to see him up closer to 20. But the thing is, he had 97% of the total expected points in this backfield. So in better matchups, Sanders looks like he's going to absolutely smash. He's dominating snaps right now. He also ran a route on 76% of dropbacks. There were only 3 running backs this week who are above 70% in terms of routes run per dropback. Mike Davis, who's at 79%, Ezekiel Elliott, who's at 77%, and Miles Sanders, who's at 76%. David Montgomery was next on the list at 69%. Especially in this offense, I think Sanders' involvement in the passing game is extremely bullish. This is a team that is pretty desperate for passing game options. This is a team that, could be in high scoring but negative game scripts. We could see that this week against the Ravens. If the Ravens kind of smash them early, Sanders could be pretty heavily involved in a comeback effort. Sanders is looking like just an absolute smash pick and true workhorse right now. Would be nice to see the offense get going a bit more, though. Boston Scott played on 12% of the snaps this week after 15% last week. He had 0.6 expected points. You can churn him out in your FFPC leagues. He's purely a contingent play. right now. And even if Sanders were to go down, although I think Scott would get mixed in on the goal line, he would get some of the receiving work, probably a lot of the receiving work. I think he lacks like workhorse upside. He'd still be ceding a fair amount of like the traditional running back rushing role to like Corey Clement or whoever. So don't think he's like a must drop, but because he does have decent contingent value, but he doesn't have this huge contingent value to where he'd be like a league winner type, and he just has no standalone value. So definitely someone that you can throw back if you need to. At wide receiver, Travis Fulgham went 10 for 152 for 1 this week on 13 targets. He had 2 for 57 for 1 last week. Last week he ran a route on 62% of dropbacks. That was up to 81% this week. So Travis Fulgham is coming on right now. Who is this guy? He ran Okay, so let's do a little profile on Travis Fulgham. He's a 4-year college player out of Old Dominion who was drafted in the 6th round by the Lions in 2019, got cut, ended up bouncing around a little bit, obviously now with the Eagles. He had a strong senior season in college. He had 30% of his team's receiving yards, 43% market share of touchdowns, which is nice. But that senior breakout is something to be skeptical of. You want guys who are seniors, 4-year players, to be really strong over their entire career in college. He was not. He had 22% market share of yards over his career, which is not very good. However, he did put up 28% of his team's touchdowns over his career, which is a bit better. And he's 6'2", 215. He's got a 36.5-inch vertical. So you could, think that maybe touchdowns would be something that be a plus element to his game. So he has that going for him. He runs a 4.58 40, which isn't great, but he's definitely in like the NFL quality range for a big wide receiver. But he's not a great prospect. However, now in 2 games, he has a 26% target share, 30% air yard share, is being targeted on 27.3% of his routes. I think if you can get him cheaply, if he's a cheap play, he definitely checks out as a dart throw type. He still has a bit of upside in terms of his playing time. So that's something to where he's going to probably regress down in terms of his targets per route run and stuff. But if he's out there, if he's going to be running more routes, up to 81% this week, we could see him up maybe 86, 87 towards 90% next week. Then that would help counteract that a little bit. That said, we do have Deshaun Jackson and Alshon Jeffrey probably going to be back this week, so things could get shaken up. So Fulgham might be a little bit thin with those guys coming back, but man, I mean, he's been very heavily involved in a way that's been impressive. So keep your eye on him. Definitely, I think, worth a cheap ad in season long. At tight end, Zach Ertz just looking done. He's got he ran a route on 86% of dropbacks, produced just 1 reception for 6 yards. He's out there all the time and just not getting it done. And on the season, he's been targeted on just 16.4% of his routes. He has a yards per target of just 4.4. Really gross. The 4.4 yards per target should improve, but Zach Ertz has not been an efficient per target player for some time now, so I don't think it's going to bounce up like substantially. He's not going to finish the season out, with like a 10 yards per target, I don't think. And so the problem really is that he's not getting targeted at a high rate. He does lead the team in routes run per dropback. He's run a route on 89% of dropbacks. So that's good, I guess, but with this little involvement, it's maybe not good because there's no way to go up. He's already kind of maxed out in terms of his playing time. And now we have Alshon Jeffrey, Deshaun Jackson, Dallas Goedert, Jalen Reagor, Jeffrey and Jackson could be back next week. And then we got Goedert and Reagor who are due back later in the year. So you could see things getting worse for him in his ability to earn targets. I mean, maybe like a guy like Jackson opens up some targets in the middle of the field for Ertz. But I don't think Alshon Jeffrey getting back is a good thing for Zach Ertz necessarily. So if you've got Zach Ertz, you've got to figure out another option this week. We have him in our ship taking team with Davis Maddock. We have Gerald Everett there. I'm going to be arguing pretty strongly that we are not in a good place at tight end. I do not, as I outlined earlier, feel good about the Rams in terms of their tight end situation, because I do think that it's still a split favoring Higbee. And so we have got to figure out tight end on that team with Zach Ertz and Gerald Everett. I don't really feel like we have a tight end who we can reliably start right now. It's been really gross for Zach Ertz. Definitely could rebound, but it's been really gross so far. In Pittsburgh, James Conner played on 63% of snaps, had a workload of 17.4 points. He lost 6 points to Benny Snell, 5 points to Ray McLeod, and 1.3 points to Anthony McFarland, which was definitely pretty tough. I mean, he could have had a huge game if he didn't lose so much to the other guys here. He's definitely the lead back here, but definitely, this week kind of put a dent in the idea that he's a workhorse in this offense. At wide receiver, we got to start with the star, Chase Claypool. You know that he put up 4 touchdowns. You know that he had 7 for 110 through the air. You know that he had a rushing touchdown as well as 3 receiving touchdowns. But do you know that he only ran a route on 66% of dropbacks this week? He played 69% of snaps. This guy is not a full-time player yet, and he's still putting up these massive totals. I mean, and this is not the only week where he's done some crazy things. He's had these big plays all season. Now we've got Deontay Johnson potentially missing week 6 with a back injury that knocked him out of this game, opened up some more playing time for Claypool, which he took full advantage of. So, if we got a full-time Claypool here, it's a pretty scary thought for what he can do. On the season, Claypool has a 14% target share and a 28% air yard share, but he's run a route on just 49% of dropbacks. So he's basically like, if he was running a route on 100% of dropbacks, we could be looking at a guy who is just a true alpha wide receiver 1. Obviously, he won't get up to 100%, but we could see him up into the high 80s, low 90s. I mean, Juju Smith-Schuster ran a route on 97% of dropbacks. So they are willing to use a guy on nearly 100% of routes. With the last thing on Claypool, he's getting a route on 25.7% of his routes, and he has an ADOT of 13.8. So, again, if you're getting that deep threat role, which is an ADOT 13.8, but you're getting targeted at an extremely high rate, that's how you get this massive value at wide receiver, looking like a potential alpha wide receiver 1 if he gets the chance to be one. He's going to get that chance this week if Johnson misses. So very exciting for Claypool. Juju Smith-Schuster ran around on 97% of his dropbacks, only targeted on 15% of his routes. Juju now for the season has a targets per route run of 16.4%. His value is being kept up by the fact that he's out there on nearly every dropback. He was out there 97% this week. On the season, he's run a route on 96% of dropbacks, but not getting targeted. His low targets per route run is concerning, and it's especially concerning given his ADOT, which is just 5. So now we've got Chase Claypool emerging and showing an ability to earn targets at an extremely high rate. Deontay Johnson also looking like he was ahead of Juju Smith-Schuster as well. So it's getting concerning on Smith-Schuster. Someone to probably shop around, especially if Johnson misses and Smith-Schuster has a good box score game, but does not improve in his ability to earn targets. If we see that, then I'm ready to start shopping him pretty aggressively, even in Dynasty. I think it's just like this is kind of crowded right now. Smith-Schuster is a free agent after the season, and he's now potentially looking like he could be coming off a down year, 2 down years in a row. This down year that we kind of chalked up to Ben Roethlisberger missing, but now if Roethlisberger's back, he kind of has another down year, and then the team doesn't really show much interest in re-signing him. He's not going to be treated by the market as this premium asset at that point. I think he could lose quite a bit of value. So he's someone that I think need to be careful of our exposure to in dynasty leagues and looking very, very closely at what the underlying metrics say this week with Deontay Johnson out. Can he get targets at a high rate with Deontay Johnson out, and teams now aware that they need to be taking Chase Claypool seriously? At tight end, Eric Ebron had a nice game this week with a target on 22% of his routes. He ran a route on 77% of dropbacks. His targets per route run on the season is only 17.7%, so still seems like kind of a hit or miss option, but nice week in terms of his ability to get targets. And maybe he benefits from Johnson's absence as well. In San Francisco, Raheem Mostert played on 48% of snaps, Jerick McKinnon on 25%, and Jeff Wilson on 23%. JaMychal Hasty even got in the game a little bit. He was in on 3% of snaps, I think 2 snaps in this game. The workload was similarly split in terms of expected points, with Mostert getting 9.5, McKinnon getting 6, and Wilson getting 3.1. I'm thinking that this Wilson involvement is really about Mostert working back, and I expect that Mostert will take over a lot of that Jeff Wilson workload as things move forward. At wide receiver, Deebo Samuel's back. He ran around on 90% of dropbacks, had 23% of targets, 25% of air yards, had an 8 out of 9.9. Profiling is that kind of classic wide receiver 1 in this offense. Brandon Ayuk ran a route on 98% of his dropbacks, so he's out there even more than Samuel was, but being used as a pure deep threat, he had an 8 out of 18.8. This led to him being targeted on just 13% of his routes. It's also how he got to a 36% air yard share, though. So kind of a boom-bust role for Ayuk. Hopefully he'll be worked in on short throws and rushing attempts going forward. Would like to see him with a bit of a shallower ADOT so that he's not going to be quite so volatile. I don't know that this is necessarily an offense where you want to be starting the deep threat, the pure deep threat in it. At tight end, George Kittle had a down game in the box score, but he was still targeted on 23% of his routes, ran a route on 75% of his dropbacks. So I think we're going to get more monster performances from Kittle soon. We'll have to wait for another week. Didn't quite deliver this week for Kittle. In Seattle, Chris Carson saw his workload drop to 14.8 points this week from 20.2 expected points last week. But he ceded just 1.6 points to Travis Homer, so that was nice. However, I'm wondering if maybe that was a little bit of a mirage in terms of Homer just not getting the expected points, because Homer was involved a fair amount in terms of his snap count. Chris Carson played 57% of the snaps to Homer's 43%. So it could just be kind of variance that Carson dominated the expected points the way he did this week. However, Carson does continue to be involved in the passing game, and so I think he can handle a split backfield better than most running backs can. At wide receiver, DK Metcalf had a 37% target share, which is kind of nuts given his ADOT of 17.2. He had 48% of the air yards in this game. Metcalf ran a route on 95% of dropbacks. He's delivering unmatched consistency at the wide receiver position this year. Really just an amazing breakout season for DK Metcalf. Tyler Lockett ran a route. Tyler Lockett ran a route on 98% of his dropbacks and was targeted on just 13% of his routes. On the season, we're now starting to see a little bit of difference between DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. Lockett's Whopper is down to 0.51 compared to 0.66 for Metcalf. I think at this point, it's fair to say that Metcalf is the wide receiver 1 in this offense. We're seeing, we talked earlier about DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson, seeing a much bigger split here in Whopper between these two than we are Moore and Anderson. DJ Moore still up at 0.6 compared to Lockett at 0.51. So there's a significant split here, although obviously with Seattle, we still really, really want the wide receiver 2 in this offense. Not necessarily a huge blow to Lockett, but I think, if you're kind of viewing them in your mind as like co-wide receiver 1s, the evidence is sort of pointing us to Metcalf really being the wide receiver 1 so far. I mean, that's what the numbers over the course of this season are pointing to. At tight end, Will Dissly scored a touchdown in this one, but ran a route on just 24% of dropbacks. Greg Olsen ran a route on 76% of dropbacks, but was targeted on just 3% of his routes, which is super, super gross. Really tough to put him in any type of lineup right now. And let's see. Tampa Bay Buccaneers we've got next. At running back, Ronald Jones. He set a season high last week in snaps. He had 64% of the snaps in week 4. He topped that this week. He set a new season high with 69% of the snaps. So very nice for Ronald Jones. Keyshawn Vaughn played 25% of the snaps. And the emergency-only Leonard Fournette was only in for an end-of-the-half kneel down. So nice game for Ronald Jones in terms of the snap count. Jones had a strong workload in terms of expected points as well with 16. Vaughn siphoned off a not insignificant 4 points there. Jones has looked really, really good in the rushing game. Among qualifying running backs, Rojo's now 4th in the NFL in yards after contact per attempt, behind only Nick Chubb, Aaron Jones, and Devin Singletary. This is an advanced stat from Pro Football Reference. Ronald Jones was running back 14 in that same metric last year, so it's been a strength of his game. In fairness, it's also a strength of Leonard Fournette's game. He hasn't had enough rushes to qualify this year, but he was very strong in the metric last year. Both of these backs look to be very strong after contact runners. Jones, though, is struggling as a receiver. He's left 9.8 points on the field as a receiver in the last 2 weeks. One of those was that tipped pass from Tom Brady where Jones was in the end zone and, would have caught that. I think he's probably being penalized in expected points for the fact that he caught the ball, then rolled into the end zone, but was ruled down. I mean, that should have been a touchdown. So I got to defend my boy Rojo. I think some of this negative fantasy points over expectation is really kind of not on him, but we've also seen him drop balls. I don't think that he has necessarily made a super strong case for a lot of receiving work. And you see that Keyshawn Vaughn, who they hadn't really trusted at all, was in immediately in that third down role ahead of Rojo. So Rojo looks like he's kind of blocked from that third down hurry up role right now and a bit limited to kind of the more 2-down role. But in this offense, that role does come with receptions at least. My hope going forward is that Leonard Fournette returns and plays a version of the McCoy role so that we get, because I think you're going to have Fournette involved to some degree. You do have Vaughn in this game, I think, maybe missing his opportunity. He had that, what looked like a drop at the time, where then it cut to Brady, screaming on the sideline. I believe he said, "Get me a running back who can fucking catch," after Vaughn dropped that ball. Then it was reversed to a fumble. So, lost fumble. So not a good sign for Vaughn. I don't think that the status quo is going to remain. But, Fournette's going to be involved once he gets back. But Jones just put up back-to-back 100-yard games. So I'm thinking he probably will retain lead back duties on early downs. My hope is that even though we bid up and got Vaughn in some leagues and stuff, I'm hoping that Fournette comes back and pushes Vaughn to the side, at least to start. Maybe Fournette disappoints and then Vaughn can get back involved. But I just really do not want this to be a 3-man committee again. That's going to suck the value down for everybody. And so that's the risk here going forward, is that Fournette returns, Vaughn stays involved, and Fournette and Jones end up kind of splitting that early down role, and no one is really that startable. At wide receiver, Mike Evans had a 22% target share and a 20% air yard share. Not bad considering that Godwin missed the game and Scotty Miller airballed, but definitely not ideal either. Would have liked to see him a little bit more involved. Miller ran around on 73% of dropbacks, so it's definitely strange that he literally wasn't targeted. Tyler Johnson had a game that we were kind of expecting from Miller. 4 for 61, 15% of targets, 18% of air yards. Nice game from Tyler Johnson. Johnson was a very strong prospect. One of these 4-year players who's extremely productive over his entire career. Just the NFL was never interested in him for some reason. I don't really know why. Fell to the 6th round. Definitely someone to move quickly on if he does emerge. The weird thing here, though, is that, he kind of had a stronger real-life game than like opportunity game, because Godwin is coming back here, and Tyler Johnson was targeted on just 14% of his routes. So outside of like dynasty leagues, I'm not all that interested in Johnson yet, but I definitely have my eye on him. At tight end, even with O.J. Howard out, Rob Gronkowski ran a route on just 64% of dropbacks. He had a targets per route run of 18%. Cameron Brate picked up a lot of the slack here. He ran a route on 41% of dropbacks and had a targets per route run of 33%, basically slotting into the exact same role that O.J. Howard had. Brate is being targeted at exactly the same rate, 29.5% target per route run for the season, which is right where O.J. Howard was, and running a very similar amount of routes now. So I think he's definitely worth hanging on to in tight end premium. He's kind of the new O.J. Howard, who was looking like he might start eating more into Rob Gronkowski's role. All right, let's close it out here with Washington. At running back, Antonio Gibson got up to 56% of the snaps last week, or this week rather. Still doesn't best where he was in week 2, where he hit 65%, but it's the second time he's been above 45%, so that's good at least. Unfortunately, J.D. McKissic was on the field nearly as much. He had 50% of the snaps, and he stole 7.3 expected points from Gibson. Gibson had a workload of just 8.9 points on the day, which is not going to be enough to really make any noise with. At wide receiver, if you're bullish on Terry McLaurin because he was clearly going to dominate targets and air yards in the preseason, you are 100% right. McLaurin ran a route on 100% of dropbacks. He had 70% of Washington's air yards this week, 70%. On the season, he is wide receiver 2 in air yard share behind Adam Thielen. He is completing, that theory. He really is. He's delivering on it. The problem is that anyone who faded McLaurin because of this awful Washington offense is feeling pretty good right now too, because McLaurin just got a 3.7 yards per target this week. He turned 40 routes and 7 targets into just a 3 for 26 line. So, you're going to get some really, really gross weeks out of this offense, but I care more about the opportunity. I think that, we should see some strong weeks from this offense, and McLaurin basically is this passing offense right now. So any strong weeks for this offense will be very strong weeks for McLaurin. He gets the Giants this week and kind of sets up nicely with Slayton, who I talked about earlier, is just dominating air yards and really being a true alpha wide receiver 1 for the Giants. He and Slayton are kind of a nice little mini correlation, I think, this week. At tight end, Logan Thomas, he's stopped earning targets. He had a targets per route run of 5% last week, and this week he was up slightly, but still really bad, 8% target per route run. So he was really inefficient on his targets all season, and now he's stopped getting them. On the season now, his targets per route run is down to 16%. His yards per target is at 3.7. He's still running a lot of routes, but this offense is just not an offense where you can just take guys who are running a lot of routes. You need them to be getting targeted at a very high rate like McLaurin. You need them really to be getting targeted down the field like McLaurin. And you need them to actually be good, which it's starting to look like Logan Thomas may not be good, or at least not good enough to overcome really bad quarterback play. So Logan Thomas is now just looking like a full fade at this point as he loses the thing that I was excited about, which was that he was getting targeted at one point on a high rate of his targets. So we will close it there. This has been the week 5 edition. So we'll plan to be back here next week. Obviously didn't get a chance to do the Bills game on Tuesday Night Football. Hopefully that game goes and we get a nice little Tuesday night game. If you're listening to this on a podcast version, please go to YouTube and subscribe there. We're really trying to build up our YouTube channel right now. And if you have any interest in checking out these charts that Sam Hoppen created, I think they add a nice visual element to this show as well. But yeah, thanks everybody for listening. And we'll be back on Wednesday. Going to do a little bit more of a review of our teams thus far this week than we have in our previous waiver wire shows. So check us out at 9:15 Eastern on YouTube on Wednesday night. And I need to get better at lining up the outro here. And we are out.